Hello, and welcome to another episode of Coffee and Comics. I'm Todd A.
I am Taylor Drask. Hi, Todd.
Good morning, Taylor.
A fine West Coast morning to you, sir.
Yes, we are in the same time zone, although not the same city.
Sadly. No, I am in Portland, Oregon this weekend as well for Design Week. I've been wanting to come to it for a while, and one of my partners at my agency I run is based here, and so I thought, I'll use some frequent flyer miles. I'll come on up and we'll go to Design Week and attend all the cool stuff and hopefully have some meetings at the same time. But in addition to that, it also lets me come. I consider Portland sort of the motherland of comics. Image is here now. I think Dark Horse was here or is here. Like, there's so many, like Floating World is here. Portland has probably per capita like the most awesome comic shops all in one, vicinity, all in one sort of square radius or square mileage or however you want to. I can't do math this morning. Anyway, it's a wonderful. It's like a mecca per capita. I guess. Yeah. It's an amazing city for comics and graphic novels. So I was like, I definitely wanted to do a show this morning while live from here.
Sort of in the spirit.
In the spirit, yeah. Because you'd asked me, you're like, "Hey, should we record?" I'm like, "Heck yes, we should." I'll literally be in the motherland. Like, we need to do it. And I had a chance yesterday to go to. I would say my three favorite shops here are Bridge City. One that I can never remember. I think it's something Dreams, and then the other one is Floating World. And Floating World is downtown Portland, and it has the distinction of being both a amazing indie shop, but also a indie publisher. So all their stuff is in the store, and then they've just got the best. Like, for somebody like me who usually goes a little more indie more often than not, like, it's an amazing just curation, and you'll see stuff that you haven't even heard of before that might be your new favorite thing. So I spent about an hour and a half there yesterday and had to leave before I spent too much money and couldn't bring it all home.
Do you want to mention any of the things that you purchased, or are you saving that for a future episode?
I'll mention them, and I might review them too, but I'll mention them just so that we have a reference point. I grabbed so it's perfect representation of what Floating World has. There is a Humanoids release, and Humanoids, for those of you who don't know, is a European publisher. They tend to get usually all the Jodorowsky stuff is on there. They've got just a bunch of really cool heavy hitting European names. Writers and artists. So they put out what's essentially an anthology. Like, it's I didn't know they did this, and I think it might be the first one they did it, but it's called The Tipping Point, and it's a Humanoids anthology by some of their biggest artists, and it all kind of focuses on that concept of the tipping point. So I can't wait to crack into that. There was a really cool little indie pick called I'm Not Here, which looks gorgeous. It looks like the art from the book Here, which I've reviewed before. But it's an actual story. It's not by the same artist, but it looks a lot like that. But it's an actual story, and it looks like it might break my heart. So I'm gonna save that one for later.
Cool.
I grabbed a couple single issues, and then the other thing I grabbed, and this is kind of very much a me pick, but it's a book called Why Art by Eleanor Davis, and it's published by Fantagraphic Books. And it's sort of I've become more and more interested in these, like, in comics as poetry. So I would say the book Here, which I just referenced, a lot of people rag on Here. And I think when you consider it as comics as poetry or graphic novels as poetry, it works so well. And I love it for that reason. Well, I'm seeing a lot more of those kind of pop up, and Floating World has a ton of them. And this one's definitely that same thing. It's kind of an examination of art through the medium of graphic novel, but it's very much a linear kind of poem, but it really just kind of talks about what art is and could be, and sort of just really re-engages and re-inspires you. So I was like, I had to pick this up.
So is it sort of an explainer, kind of like Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics? Or
not in the same, I mean, only vaguely. Like,
okay.
Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics is an academic book, I think, first and foremost. Like, that's the book if you were taking a college course on comics, that is the book they would assign to you. And for good reason. It's an amazing study. And for anybody who is really interested in getting into the nuts and bolts of how comics work, please pick that up. This is less that and more of like, this is just art in general, right? So it's all like some basic, very simple drawings with a lot of text on the side, and it flows more like I can't even think of a comparison, but it talks about like visual art, and there's one story about this woman whose art was just kissing people or telling them that she loves them, and like that was her expression. So it kind of walks through In fact, on the back, it just goes, what is art? Why art? What is it? Who is it for? What is it for? These are questions that have vexed scholars and historians and makers of art and lovers of art since the beginning of civilization. What color is art? Can beautiful art be ugly? Can ugly art be beautiful? It just goes into like all those questions and kind of explores them in a really simple, sort of poetic way. So it's not that, I mean, Scott McCloud really dissects it. This is more just like a love letter to art told through the graphic novel medium. So it's kind of, there's a lyrical kind of quality to it that I really like. And it's kind of it's a sub genre that I think is finally picking up speed. In fact, Floating World even like had their own section called like, comics as poetry. And I was like, that explains it. And they had a copy of Here on that wall. So I was like, well, this really sums it up well. And I'm going to start using that more and more because it really, there's a certain grouping of books that I could never quite wrap my head around in terms of how to explain them. And I think that really does it. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Well, if there's another thing that Portland is known for, it is coffee.
Yes.
And heroin. So,
really? Heroin too, huh?
Which of those are you trying this morning? And if it's Starbucks for either, you are fired. I am certain.
Yeah, and then we're gonna have to get news. No, it fortunately not. Thank God not. I decided to skip the heroin this morning. I mean,
it's a downer. You don't want to.
Yeah, no. I'm actually. So I'm staying with my lovely friends Pinky and Laura at their house, and they always have a good stash of coffee lying around. So I just filled up on that. I don't even know what the origin or the beans are. I just know it's strong and awesome. And I'll just give, since that's a vague answer, I'll give a little shout out. There's a coffee shop here in Portland called Dragonfly, which is my absolute favorite coffee shop. I mean, Portland's got, you throw a rock, you're going to find an amazing coffee shop. But Dragonfly is its own special blend of just wonderful stuff. And they had a cardamom vanilla cappuccino that I had yesterday that was just unbelievable. So I'll give a shout out to that.
Nice shout out. I'm throwing you a curveball this morning. I'm not even drinking coffee.
Well, then you're fired, sir. This is the last Coffee and Comics episode. Goodbye, everybody. It's been fun.
I'm trying to change the name already. No, I've got a gunpowder green tea.
Ooh, well, that works.
Yeah.
That's the same. That's part of the coffee family. It's a distant cousin.
I hope so. It's actually delicious. Although I made the error of fixing it, having a couple sips. And then right before we started, I ran and brushed my teeth and came back and was like, oh, note to self, don't drink this tea directly after brushing teeth. So
before going on a date, is this a coffee? Is this a green tea? It's like gunpowder's in the name. Do you feel the blast?
I haven't gotten the kick. There's the one I got was listed as a medium caffeine. So, okay. But maybe this is the way to start my day. So we'll see. Maybe I save the coffee for like an afternoon jolt snack. Something.
I don't want to be an elitist. Like tea is a perfect. I mean, like in fact, Dazbog Coffee, which is largely a Colorado-based place, always had gunpowder tea in their offerings too. So it's a perfectly acceptable substance.
All right. Cool. Yeah. Well, again, we don't want to change the name, so I'll make sure. I honestly, my reasoning. Well, it was just besides laziness, I guess is the reasoning. I also all week kept waiting. I was trying to think of what's a new roaster I can try for my coffee this week, and did not decide on anything until about 11 o'clock last night. And then, of course, thought I'll get up at like 7. I'll drive over there. I'll just get myself a coffee, but I'll also get a roast, and then I'll be ready for next week. And I'll be able to talk about the coffee I got. And then at 7 o'clock, I thought, no, I'm just gonna lie in bed for another hour or so. So
we'll just change the name to Coffee and Comics and tea occasionally, but also wine.
Coffee and Comics with tea and tea.
Ooh, I like that. Yeah.
So tea. Explain this show to people. What do we do here?
So on Coffee and Comics, Todd and I sit down, and each week we review one graphic novel or series or comic that is interesting to us, and share it with you guys. And we don't know what the either is going to pick. So there's some surprise and intrigue for us as hosts. But the whole goal is to help you guys listening pick new stuff that you may not have heard of. Maybe there's a book you've been wanting to get your hands on. You're just like, well, shoot, I need somebody to tell me what to expect. This solves that problem for you. We're kind of, I jokingly refer to us as the kids at the end of Reading Rainbow. When LeVar goes, you don't have to take my word for it. That's when we step in and we tell you about a book. And then we also tell you about some coffee too that we're drinking, and have a good little time. So think this is like, we like to record these in the mornings. We like, people, maybe that you're listening to this on a weekend. Maybe you're listening to this on a New Comics Day. Usually it drops on Wednesday. So, pick us up, listen to us. Maybe before you go into the shop, we can give you a couple things to consider, and hopefully you expand your reading horizons.
Yeah, I was just at the comic book shop yesterday and doing that thing of like, there was nothing particular on my list, and I was just scanning the shelves, and hopefully we are the show that will give you some ideas for when you're doing that yourself.
And I love, by the way, that feeling. I'm glad you did that, because it's usually the last couple of weeks I've been into a shop, I've had a list. I'm like, I need this and this and this.
Right.
It's such a great experience to just walk in and not know, and then walk out with something that's like, just, you had no idea what it was. You don't know what it's going to be. You flip through it. You're thinking like, this might be cool. And then you get home and it's like, this is my new favorite thing. Like that. Yeah. That's the experience that I try to aim for every time. And is actually the experience that leads me to my first book choice, Todd.
All right.
How's that for a segue? Huh?
Nice. I had a similar one that I was going to try on you if you didn't. Go for it.
Save it next week. So, for those of you who don't know, I got really heavily into comics and graphic novels around 2014. And at the end of 2014, I was in the local shop in Rapid City, South Dakota, which is fantastic, by the way. If you're ever in the Black Hills, please stop by. It's a great little shop. But I'd walked in, and I was just like, I'm going to pick up a few things, and walked in sight unseen. And on that day, I picked up a one-shot. I looked at the cover of something, and was so intrigued by the cover, and I flipped through it, and just like everything about it just really spoke to me. I'm like, I'm going to grab this. I don't know what this is, but it'll be interesting. And read it over Christmas break and absolutely fell in love with it, and ended up buying the first 3 trade paperbacks basically the same week, because I was obsessed with this thing.
Wow.
And it's a series I have name checked so many times on this show that I figured it was high time I actually review it properly. And that is, of course, East of West.
Yes.
Volume 1, The Promise, written by, once again, Jonathan Hickman. And more importantly, I think in this case, is art by Nick Dragotta, or Nick Dragotta, as I like to pronounce it. Yet to figure out how he pronounces his name. But
it's Dragotta, actually.
Dragotta. So. You actually saw a panel with him, didn't you?
Exactly.
Yeah. So Nick Dragotta, perfect. I mentioned him in particular because the art on this thing is so specific and so just, it really appeals to me. We've had episodes in the past where we talk about, there are books I appreciate, but I just don't like the art, so I really can't get into it. Another Hickman book, The Manhattan Projects, is actually one of those. I love the idea. I don't like the art, and I just can't get into it. This one, East of West, though, is not that. East of West is like, it's drawn and colored in a way that just is exactly for me. So let me give you a quick little summary. It debuted in March of 2013. And as of this recording, they're on issue number 38, I believe. So it's been running for quite a while now. I think they're up to volume 7 on the trade paperbacks, and then there's a couple omnibuses as well. We're just going to focus on volume 1, because as you get sucked into this, the twists and turns are plenty. Basically, the premise is it's a sci-fi Western set in a dystopian version of the United States, and the fate of everybody rests with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So we'll come back to that in a second. The tagline, as Hickman has kind of conceived it, of East of West, is the things that divide us are stronger than the things that unite us. And that, he came up with this in 2013. Just think about how apropos that is now compared to even 2013. And he goes on to explain the end times are imminent, and we all hate each other too much to come together and solve our problems. Our final destination is imminent, and as is the apocalypse. And then, in the face of all that despair and gloom, somewhere there is still hope. So again, 2013, and this was relevant then too, but I mean, just think about the climate that we're in now in 2018. And just like this, I had forgotten that was sort of the tagline. So as I was researching and putting together my notes for this episode, I was like, oh my God, like I almost want to go back and reread it all again, just with that sort of in mind, like thinking about where we are. As far as the summary goes, basically, it's a dystopian America. The history of America is the same up to the Civil War. And at that point in this alt timeline, instead of the Civil War ending, a meteor hits what's essentially Missouri and just wipes out, like 100-mile radius. And there's this, this big meteor hits. And at that same time, essentially it throws everything into an alternative, reality where the Civil War never ends. The Confederacy, essentially it's stalemate. So the Confederacy becomes its own country. The Union remains its own country, but it's, just the original, Union. So that kind of essentially the Northeast. Texas, of course, becomes its own country. What was really intriguing to me was the slaves that freed themselves or were freed rallied and created the Free Kingdom of New Orleans. So the African American population kind of congeals and forms their own thing, and it's the Kingdom of New Orleans is very Wakanda-like. So keep that in mind. We'll come back to that. A new interesting twist is China during this time. So China invades the West Coast and sets up the PRA, which stands for the People's Republic of America. So San Francisco becomes like the new Chinese capital, and it's really cool. And in some of the shots, the Golden Gate Bridge exists, but it's got decisively Chinese architecture kind of on it. Those swooping kind of rooftops and everything, which is especially interesting too because I'm in the Northwest right now, and you kind of think like, what if the Northwest is there's a lot of like, things you would find in China and Japan, aesthetics and environment and topography, you find in the Northwest. So it's kind of interesting considering like, what if the Chinese just invaded and took it over? The most interesting thing to me about this alternative timeline, though, is that Red Cloud, Indian chief Red Cloud, unites all the tribes into one. He kind of does the Genghis Khan thing and unites all the tribes into one giant tribe, and they form what's called the Endless Nation. So they kind of take over what's the Midwest and kind of the South Dakota, Minnesota, where you see a lot of American Indian tribes now. Like that's where they that whole territory is basically theirs. And I'll come back to them in a second too, because they're the most interesting aspect of the story. That's sort of the setup, and that kind of occurs in volume 1. That occurs in like the first 4 pages. So you get like this crash course of these, like all these amazing scenes and images. You're like, oh my God, like you buy into this world so quickly because they just kind of, they tee that alt history up, and then they refer to it a lot, but that sort of really tees it up. And then they show you a couple quick pages of sort of the main storyline, which is on the same day that this comet or this meteor impacts the Earth, there's this treaty that basically is like this armistice that there's this treaty that's signed that basically says, okay, the Civil War there'll be a standoff. We're in a permanent armistice. Texas was a signee on that. The Kingdom of New Orleans, all the countries I just mentioned, all the nations represented, that in this new version of the United States or ununited states, they all signed this armistice.
So are they all sort of seen at this point as the nations of America?
They don't use that term specifically. Okay. They are their own countries. It just happens to exist on the continent, where America is now is like it's all subdivided in these ways that I just described. But when they sign that armistice treaty, at the same time, there are 2 simultaneous but independent prophecies. On one hand, you have this guy named Elijah Longstreet, who was a soldier with the Confederate Army under Stonewall Jackson. He wrote a part of this prophecy, and then as soon as he's done writing it, he collapses and dies. Red Cloud, who united the Endless Nation, at that exact same time, he also has a vision and transmits his portion of the prophecy orally. And then as soon as he does that, he collapses and dies. So you have these 2 chunks of these 2 kind of prophecies that line up with each other that were given to 2 separate men. For 50 years, 50 years goes by, and these prophecies were kind of referred to as the message, and a sort of a cult arises around these prophecies because they refer to the end times. But they are largely incomplete. So for 50 years, people are like, hey, these 2 guys had these interconnected prophecies, but it's not complete, but they talk about the end times. Well, then in 1958, Chairman Mao, who is the head of the PRA, or the People's Republic of America, he writes an addendum in his little red book, which is the 3rd piece of the prophecy. And then he dies. So you've got these 3 pieces that kind of form this like Zelda Triforce looking thing. And it's a complete book of the message, and it refers to the end times and how the end times will be ushered in. And so again, this cult and these kind of like these people who who follow the end times. They grow in numbers. It's kind of like Scientology. They all sort of kind of. I can't let an episode go by without referencing that. So they kind of form, and they at the crash site of the meteor, enough time has passed where enough of the radiation has gone to everything. They built this giant kind of temple to the prophecy, because that site is where they sign the Armistice Treaty, and then that's where the message is kept. So that sort of sets up the world. The story itself for Volume 1 everything I just described happens in like the first 6 or 7 pages. It's just relentless. It's amazing. The story begins where there's kind of like this Stonehenge looking thing in the old American Southwest, and the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse return, and but they return as children, and there's like they're specifically colored. So if you've ever seen like a red guy and a blue guy and a green woman or a green girl, those are the horsemen. But one of them is missing. So they appear, and like the 4th kind of little pedestal where they appear is empty, and they're looking around. They're like, "Where's Death?" And you come to find out that Death, who's the white one, he never left. When they sort of the last time they were around, they all vanished. And he was supposed to go with them, and he didn't. So he's still a grown man, and he's wandering around as Death, and he's kind of a vigilante, and you don't, as the story starts, you don't quite know what his motives are, but he's sort of our antagonist, or sorry, rather our protagonist for this story, and you kind of like see the world through his eyes largely, and he's accompanied by 2 mystics from the Endless Nation. So then they're also like pitch white, which if you listen to the last couple episodes, Jonathan Hickman has this running theme where characters who appear in all white skin, all white hair, all white clothing represent death in some way. He's got it in Black Monday Murders. He's got it in The Dying and the Dead. And now, as you referenced so precisely, Death himself is this kind of presented in this way.
Yeah, so and you mean literally like the whatever white is it the absence of all color or the collection of all color? It is like, it's not, you're not making an ethnic,
not Caucasian. Yeah, no color, actual color white, like as pure white. Yeah, not Caucasian, not ethnically driven, like just pure as a character of pure white. So it's kind of this thing Hickman's doing. I don't think there's some grand scheme to make all these worlds unite, unless somewhere down the road he wants to pull a Stephen King and do a Dark Tower, and that would be awesome. But for right now, I just think it's just a little Easter egg he does in each of his stories.
I think there's such a cool thing, because I have read Volume 1, and there's such a cool thing about Death when you meet that character, because it is very much like you mentioned. This is a sort of Old West or Western sci-fi. Mm. It's a Western sci-fi in the future, yes. And it is. Like he's playing off that trope of like a stranger comes to town.
Yes.
This is the start of so many Westerns. And also that other thing of like, the stranger all in black.
Yeah.
And in this case, the stranger shows up and he is like literally, like his clothing is white. His skin is white. Like everything is the same white color. And then he has these 2 members of the Endless Nation with him. So it's
what an astute observation. I never even thought of that. Yeah, he's not the man in black, he's the man in white.
Yeah, but
he's not like a good guy. It's like that.
Right.
It's subverting that Western trope even more. Like, I never even thought about that. That's great.
Yeah, I mean that scene when he walks into the bar, the first one, like that to me was just the culmination of so many Western things coming together right there. It's like literally the saloon doors swinging in the background.
And he's awesome. Like Death as a character is incredible. Like if they ever make this as a TV or a movie, then if they don't cast Josh Holloway, who played Sawyer in Lost, if they don't cast him as Death, then something's wrong with the world. Like that's who I imagine talking. Like he even kind of looks like him. It's crazy. A lot of people will say, "Oh, he looks like Clint Eastwood." I'm like, yeah, but that was maybe in the in the 60s. But like this guy, I mean, go Google Josh Holloway and then go Google like Death, and it's like they're the same damn guy. Like I can't. There will be no justice in the world if that doesn't happen. Anyway,
I could go for a Nikolai Coster-Waldau.
Ooh, that what?
It's sort of the rich man's Josh Holloway.
You're so right. Oh my God, that would work too.
Sawyer is just the poor man's Jamie Lannister, right?
I can't argue with that. That's again astute observation, sir. I'm at your mercy. So the whole Volume 1 kicks off with him, as you said, walking to this saloon, and you kind of the story starts with him, and progresses at a really nice clip. You follow him, but you also get to see different parts of, you get to see kind of through his eyes. He sort of introduces you to the other characters. He's the way you get to see the leader of the PRA. It's kind of, Mao's great, or grandson or son, and then his great granddaughter eventually take over the PRA. You get to see Death, face the president of the Union. There's the whole first part of this volume 1 is built on kind of this vendetta that Death is on. And you get to learn what happened to him, why he probably didn't disappear with the rest of the horsemen. Maybe some of the horsemen, betrayed him in some major way. And you get a really good sense of the mythology of why he's on this quest, what he's after, who he loved at one point, who betrayed him. And it really humanizes him pretty quickly, which is awesome. You get to really feel like this isn't just a monolith character. It's a really multi-dimensional guy who's, he's after something specific. I don't want to spoil a lot. And honestly, you'll read volume 1 and you didn't necessarily do this, but if you're like me, you read volume 1, you're like, I need to read volume 2 now. And so I cranked through those first 3 really, really fast.
Yeah. My problem, as I've said on other episodes, was not that I didn't want to read it, but that there was, it was like I just felt the fear of am I going to go spend $500 on this comic book today? Because if I've read volume 2, I would have come home, read it immediately, gone back, read volume 3. So I just felt like I need to wait for this to wrap up and then start getting omnibus editions or something.
That is a great idea. I have, in fact, volumes 1, 2, and 3 are in year 1. And I think, 4, 5, 6 are in year 2. And so they're currently on 7. So year 3 as a hardcover omnibus will come out soon. I'll stop there in terms of the summary because I want to get into kind of my personal love of this. Because I've referenced it so much and people have asked me, why do you like this story so much? Here's why. I came into the story via the East of West, the World one shot that I mentioned. I highly recommend, if you're curious about this series, start with that, because it really sets up a lot of the mythology of the different country, the new countries of the United States, how what goes into that, where the timeline starts and stops. It was really instructive, and it gave me a really deep sense of the world building. So when I started volume 1, I was invested already. I knew a lot of these things, so it made way more sense to me. The World one shot also has a little mini story with the horsemen, so you get a flavor for kind of the craziness of how the story works. And it's a little confusing because that little one shot story drops you in I think around volume 3, so you're not quite sure, but it doesn't matter. It just kind of gives you a flavor for what to expect. And it's so if you're like, well, am I going to like the art? Am I going to like the style? Or is this going to be too violent, not violent enough? That little mini story gives you a really kind of good idea of what to expect. It gives you kind of some of the humor. And it's not this is not a serious, a totally serious story all the way through. It's really well balanced. There's some really good humor. There's crazy violence. There's crazy mythology, but it really dials into the Western tropes a lot. It dials into the sci-fi tropes. In fact.
I'm really glad you brought up the world of because it's, when you say one shot, I mean it's literally a single issue, correct?
It is a single issue that was meant to be exactly how I discovered it, which is hey, we want more people to read this. We're going to create this because this is such a sprawling story. And in fact, I would say if you like Game of Thrones, you will like this. There's so many parallels to Game of Thrones in terms of the political intrigue, the warring factions, the backstabbing, the nuances. All of that is very, very present because all the tensions being ratcheted up between all these different countries and people and characters to get us to the apocalypse. And then the looming question is, is the world going to end because of all this, or is somebody going to prevent it because they did the right thing at the right time? And so you kind of that's sort of the oncoming storm throughout this whole thing. But there's so many amazing mini stories and subplots and just every you could get a character 3 levels down who's just as interesting as Littlefinger, and you're just well, what's his story or her story? So it's really worth getting the world because it sets all this up for you, and it really kind of talks through. It gives you a little mini bio of how each country was formed and why, and who the players are.
In that sense, does it work as sort of the World of Ice and Fire, where it's a reference guide where you can go back? Okay,
yeah, but it's not clearly as long. I mean, World of Ice and Fire is huge. This is just like a single 30-page single comic issue, but yeah, very, very, very similar. And you may say, well, is it going to spoil anything? No, it doesn't really. It really just drops you into that world. So by the time you read volume 1, you're invested in the character. You kind of know who to expect and who's going to pop up. So like when they show you a character for the first time, you're like, oh, that's that guy. And you have just an easier time tracking the story. So I love that. But honestly, before I get to this, the other thing that really works well is that it's, we've seen so many times people try to do a mashup of Western and fantasy or Western and sci-fi and fail miserably. And as a huge fan of the Western genre, I've been craving somebody to get it right. And oh my God, this gets it right. This fuses sci-fi and Western in a way that is so it's the sum of the parts is stronger than each. What's that old adage like?
The whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah. So what's really interesting is that Hickman found a way to make like the sci-fi aspects of it only enhance the Western aspects of it even more, and vice versa. And it's like I don't know how they did that, and it's especially interesting considering that, because the way I understand this is that Hickman and Dragotta have a perfect partnership. It's not like Hickman writes everything and just hands it to Dragotta. Hickman goes to Dragotta and goes, "What do you want to draw today?" And they go back and forth, and between the two of them, they kind of craft each issue around their interests and kind of, there's clearly like a world Bible they're sort of following, or an outline they're following. But like there's an issue that's in it, and Dragotta has even mentioned that you may have even been the panel you were at. Dragotta said there was an issue where Hickman just said, just do whatever you want. And Dragotta drew an entire issue that was just, there was no dialogue at all. It was just like, it was like an assassination issue. And he just drew the whole thing, and it was amazing. So it was really a great partnership. So it's amazing they're able to come up with a cohesive story in that way. And it's even more amazing they're able to fuse the Western and sci-fi genres in a way that just is so satisfying. But the real reason that all that's true, and all of that would get me hooked into this anyway. But the cherry on top for me personally, like I grew up in Western South Dakota, so I have a lot of exposure and appreciation for American Indian culture. And there's a lot of tribes have had a lot of hard times. You always kind of wonder, like, what if we hadn't put them all on reservations, as white settlers? What if we allowed them to flourish and kind of choose their own way? And this gives you an answer to that what if. And I really like what they do with the Endless Nation. I will say this, in volume 1, you really don't get to see a lot of the Endless Nation at all. In fact, the world, the East and West World one shot sets up kind of, how they come to be. But what you do find out is that they're highly, highly technologically advanced. That's the big kind of change. So when they bound them all to when Red Cloud created one Endless Nation, at some point in their history, they decided to abandon all of the mysticism. So Indian spirituality and mysticism is all kind of put aside. And there's like a very, very small subset who actually still believe in that. And the two who are accompanying death are one of a limited few. The rest of them have turned into basically it's like hyper technology, and they just really leaned into that. So all the technology that the other countries use, all the weaponry is usually crafted by the Endless Nation. So in volume 1, you get to see a couple of them, you get to see a couple of their representatives, but you don't really get a sense of their world until later on. But it's really cool because they're talked about in kind of like this mythological way. It's like the Endless Nation will, their sort of shadow is cast over everything. So it really builds up this tension when they finally do arrive. And when they arrive, the chief of the Endless Nation's wearing like this really, elegant suit, like a Kingsman suit. And he's got the tie on, and he's got like this crazy sort of headset apparatus. And he's accompanied by like another guy who's got their soothsayer is basically a guy whose brain is connected to this hyper AI. So that's their version of sort of soothsaying now. It's just really freaking well done. And as somebody who's a fan of Western culture, but also sort of a fan of the what if of the American Indian story, that really sucked me in. I could read an entire series just about the Endless Nation. And so it's cool to see that infused into all these other really cool cultures, that the logic of how, after the meteor hits or the comet hits, the logic of how everything kind of, separates and kind of hashes out makes a lot of sense. You could see this actually happening. And I'm like, that's intriguing to me. So all of that
in that way, does it, does it turn into at some point like a commentary on, races and tribes in America, or is that just sort of the background element that we have in our heads when we read it?
It does a little bit, but it's more, if anything, it talks, as you get further into the series, they talk more about how they lost their way. Like we were once a people of the plains and and nature and mysticism. And now we're like, everything is cold and technological. And there's a lot of discussion around, how they lost their way. Was that a good idea? How do they find their way? And, what is their place in the world now? They're largely, for most of the series, they're largely benign. They don't create an alliance with any country right away. As war starts to break out amongst some of these territories, like they stay largely out of it. At some point that might change, and then the repercussions for that are huge. But like they try to stay above it all because they've really surrendered themselves to like this sort of technological utopia. And so it's just really cool to see that, that twist in it. And you don't really get a sense of like, I think at that point, like all the interdependent tribes have kind of melted, potted out, if that's a term. So you don't really get a sense of like there's not like a racist element or anything in that way. It's pretty clear that they are the heavy hitters of this world, and so everybody else is kind of like trying to exist in their shadow, which is kind of cool. Anyway, I've talked way too long about this.
No. I would say, just as the person who's only read volume 1. It's really interesting to hear you talk about to tell this story again, because when we've covered East of West in previous episodes, it's been in when we used to do catch up episodes of like, what are you reading? So you would be on volume 5 or 6 or whatever. And, I understand more of how you had that complete world in your head because you'd read that single issue, East of West, the world. And I would say, like, if you just pick up volume 1, it very much seems like a sci-fi Western. It almost seems like, now, granted, I haven't seen the show, but it seems like that Westworld sort of genre of, it's, because, all those, there are just all these echoes of Western tropes, the death confronting that politician that he does. Like, I don't know if
it's the president of America, and it happens right away too. So it's like he goes and confronts for reasons of vendetta. He goes and confronts the president of America, and it's really
which is
fun.
Very much that feeling of like the man in black, the stranger who comes to town, and then he's going around settling scores, one by one, and you're going, okay, where's this leading? And then, as I recall, there is the big part of the PRA, or maybe they're actually in mainland China. At the end of this, it ends with a pretty big cliffhanger.
Yeah.
Or at least a big dramatic scene where you're I mean, it was, like I said, it was difficult for me not to run to the store and buy every volume.
Dude, this is, I sound like a broken record, but this is yet another Image series where each volume of the trade paperback feels like a perfectly self-contained season of a TV show.
Yep, for sure.
Like, even to the point where at the end of volume 1, like I think some of the characters are even like riding into the sunset, and you're like, and you almost just see the credits rolling, but you're like, but it sets up so much more. We're like,
like there is a huge finale kind of climax thing followed by a cliffhanger, and that ride off into the sunset, and you're going, oh shit, I gotta see the rest of this.
Dude, it's so good. If they don't make this a TV show at some point, I mean, it'll be very difficult because it would be expensive, but man, it would be incredibly satisfying. This is, I would say, in my top 3 favorite series of all time, period. Like, just straight up.
Well, and it, I mean, we can't say enough about the art, and we don't need to go, unless there's anything you want to say about it specifically here, because we have talked about Nick Dragotta's art several times. And I know in our episode number 43 is where I recapped last year's San Diego Comic-Con, where I talked about that panel where Nick said some very cool things. And I think it's in our second episode ever, which we numbered 0.5, where we started out having this huge comic book discussion that got cut off. But I think listeners, if they were curious, could go back to that or episode number 1 and find a lot about East of West.
Yeah.
That we've talked about.
Yeah. So what did my long-winded review aside, what did you pick this week, sir? Because we still have to get to your book.
We got to take a breath for this one.
All right.
Breathe in the funk, breathe out the jive. I texted you on Tuesday night and said, I've never been more excited to talk about a book.
Yeah.
And actually talking about East of West got me like, I was so excited about that. I've kind of like pushed my book out of my head.
Oh no.
No, it's fine. I mean, I had anyway, the book I chose is the book Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus.
My God.
This is by
my God.
Chester Brown. It is a Drawn and Quarterly title. I got a signed copy at the Drawn and Quarterly booth last San Diego Comic-Con, and I mentioned it probably in that same episode, number 43.
Mm-hmm.
Have you read this?
I have not.
Okay.
It has been one of those books. Every time I'm in a shop, always there. You always see it. You know, it's like it's one of the Drawn and Quarterly like heavy hitter titles. You know, it's like one of their greatest hits. It's always been on my pull list, but it always gets pushed down for something else. And I've always wanted somebody just to get me excited about this. So I finally just grabbed the damn thing and added it to my library. So I'm so excited about this.
Oh, so wait, you have it, but you have not.
No, I don't have it yet.
You're looking for that reason to push you.
Yeah.
Okay. So then right after I texted you with that, you texted me about this kind of kooky biblical scholar that you had been reading. What was his name?
Oh, John Marco Allegro.
Okay, who has his theory is about the wafers of communion originally being psilocybin.
he has a whole yes, he has that, but he has like a whole thing that basically and it's largely controversial, but he has a theory based on the Dead Sea Scrolls that like a lot of modern Christianity can be tied back to mushroom cults. Around the time of hunter-gatherers. So it's for anybody interested in like, you know, really kind of dissecting what, you know, where religion comes from or where belief comes from, like go at least Google the guy, you know, like there's some interesting things there to consider. And again, highly controversial, but it's interesting stuff.
You texted me about that, and then I texted back in like all caps, you are going to love this pick.
Exactly.
I mean, it was one of those things where I'd gotten this last July and had flipped through it and knew, you know, it was one of those things where I couldn't tell if it was going to be a long read that was going to take a while. And so I was sort of putting it off for that, or if I felt the opposite, like, oh yeah, I'll breeze through that in an afternoon and I'll just save it for a day when I'm really like right in the mood. I don't know what put me in the mood this week. I know I kept shuffling it in the TBR pile, you know, specifically thinking of our show, like when can I read this? It's the best impact to discuss. So the subtitle is A Prostitution and Religious Obedience in the Bible. And, you know, when I had flipped through it, it is every page of the illustrations are a very simple 4-panel layout, almost like sort of a newspaper strip. They're not in a horizontal line. It's 2 and 2. It is a very narrow book, and it's you know, I mean, it's normal book height, but it sort of looks short because it's not very wide. So you get 4 panels on the left page and 4 panels on the right page, and the drawings are really simple but incredibly effective. And one of the things that really stood out to me is these very subtle distinctions he makes to differentiate the characters. So if you think he's telling stories from the Bible with people that have names that are unfamiliar to us, even though I'm looking at the Cain and Abel story here, which are names that are very familiar to us. Just the way he has subtly drawn Cain and Abel's faces is different. And then the way that he draws Abel as more muscular than Cain is really interesting. And it's not, there's nothing exaggerated about it. It's just they will have different styles of beard, or they will have a differently shaped nose. And you'll notice he keeps that up through every panel of the story.
Wow.
So just in these tiny, tiny little, like iconographic ways, he is telling you which character is which, so that he can keep the dialogue very, very simple. That way he doesn't have to say, because it's all black and white, so he doesn't have to constantly call characters by their names or anything like that. And so there will be stories where there are the the three slaves, the parable of the talents he retells. And so there's a very distinctive way each slave is portrayed, or there will be one that's about, a group of women. And so the same thing. And it is just deceptively simple. So reading this, and, I read you the subtitle of Prostitution and Religious Obedience. The way I read that was, when I picked it up, was that these were just going to be sort of short little 4 or 5 panel, not 4 or 5 panels, 4 or 5 pages stories of prostitution. That was really what I saw. I saw the religious obedience as being part of the prostitution,
okay,
which I think Chester Brown does as well, but in a different way. So as I've already mentioned, the story of Cain and Abel is told at the beginning. And it is a pure obedience story. Adam tells Cain and Abel to pay attention and follow the laws, because when Adam and Eve disobeyed Yahweh, they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, and now they have to farm for their living, and it is extremely hard, grueling work, and they don't always have the crops every year. So Cain is very obedient to his father and to the laws of Yahweh, and Abel is not. Abel says, why aren't we eating animals? They're everywhere. So Abel builds a fence, and he starts keeping sheep there, and he's killing sheep and eating them. And one day, Adam brings Abel some bread that Eve has baked for him, and Cain asks, why are you going to let him disobey you and reward him for this? And then later on, Abel sees Cain sacrificing some of the harvest to Yahweh, and Abel says, that's a good idea. I should sacrifice some of my meat. So he sacrifices a lamb. God shows up and tells tells Abel, thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for the meat. And tells Cain, I reject your sacrifice. So, Cain can't figure out, why is God angry with me? And then Cain eventually kills Abel and says, God shows up, and God and Yahweh are the same thing, if you weren't aware of that. Cain is saying, I obeyed you. I obeyed all your rules. Like, why is he the beloved son? And you can, if you know other Bible stories, you can see how that sort of relates to the prodigal son, which is another story that's retold here. And so it jumps from that story into a story that I was not familiar with, about Tamar, who it's a very, it's not complicated, but there are a lot of details. I don't want to go through it, but she's, betrothed or married to one brother. Yes, she's married. Her husband dies, and according to custom, she must marry the brother, and then that brother will give her the son that her husband should have done. But so there's this, this complicated thing of like religious law and custom in that, and how it relates to sexuality specifically. So that's like, we get into it in the second story. We're talking about this, and there's prostitution element. I was not familiar with this, so I just read it as, oh, okay, this is this story right out of the Bible. I thought at this point, Chester is just telling us, here are simple stories, almost like mini comics out of the Bible. And then after that, is the story of Rahab and another prostitution story. And this one I was a little bit familiar with, or at least I'd heard elements of it. So again, I just thought, oh, right. Okay. He's just, graphically depicting these stories out of the Bible. This is great. And then he tells the story of Ruth, and I thought, that's pretty cool. And, I had some some stuff going on this week. So these stories were just very touching to me in this simple way that they approached relationships and sexuality in these old stories. And, the theme of obedience was there, but it wasn't really resonating with me. He tells the story of David and Bathsheba, which is another one I was mostly familiar with, and maybe questioned a couple of details in this one and thought, oh, okay, interesting. He tells this parable of the talents that Jesus told. And then he tells the story of Mary of Bethany anointing Jesus's feet, or washing his feet before his crucifixion. And this one I knew, and I went, well, wait a second, I start questioning, did she have a name, and what's going on? And it turns out that he believes that, I'll get into why this is, but he believes that Mary of Bethany and Mary Magdalene are the same person. And I guess in one of the books of the gospel, it's identified as a prostitute that washes Jesus's feet. And so there's a subtle little argument going on here. And I sort of, that's where that's probably where I picked it up when he gets to this story of Mary of Bethany. But it is oddly powerful to me, just this really simple story of a prostitute washing the feet of Jesus and weeping over his feet as she did it, and then using her hair to dry his feet. I mean, it almost brought me to tears for sure. Wow. And again, I had other stuff going on. I was in a headspace that made this like the perfect story to read, but it was a big deal. And there is how do I describe this? I'm flipping through it because I'm wondering, there was a part where I became really suspicious of Chester's telling of these stories. So after the Mary of Bathsheba, he tells a story of Matthew actually getting the idea to, like, one of the things he needed to do to write in the gospel. So this is an imagined story of Matthew is trying to figure out how to explain something in his book of Jesus's life, or his book being Matthew, the gospel, and how Matthew runs across a young girl in the street, and her name is Tamar, and he all of a sudden connects all these dots with the story that Chester Brown has told earlier in the book. And so then you see, oh wait, Chester Brown has told these stories specifically to connect some dots that Matthew is also connecting. So there is the book itself. I'm sorry that I'm stuttering. I feel like I always do this. The book itself is about 170 pages long, and they're basically all these sort of mini comics that tell those stories that I've told to you right now. But after that, there is probably 100 pages of afterword and footnotes.
Whoa, really?
So I had known, when I had picked it up and flipped through it, I thought, oh, this is cool. He's going to tell a story and then he's going to footnote it, so you kind of get the full story. And as I alluded to, what I realized is Chester Brown is making an argument. And at one point, I flipped back to the afterword and sort of referenced the page, that what he had to say about the pages in the story I just read. And that was when the light went on in my head, and when it, probably literally the moment that I texted you. Wow. Oh my God, this is a piece of critical theory. Chester Brown is making an argument about prostitution in the Bible that is really sophisticated and so amazingly told in this really simple way. And so what he's saying is that there was, and it's almost like, this is almost like a spoiler of the story. So I'm going to try to be delicate about it, because I think anyone who's interested in the history of the Bible and sort of arguments about it, and especially the way that the Bible treats sexuality, should read this, because he is showing in that chapter of Matthew figuring this out, that Matthew shows we're all, there's a common trope in the Bible that we make fun of, which is it's just lists of names, it's always, so he begat this guy and he begat this guy and they begat this girl and whatever. And it's everybody's begatting everything. And there are so many genealogies told. Yeah. But those are generally all patriarchal genealogies.
You're right. Yeah.
Until Matthew mentions these 4 or 5 women in discussing Jesus's mother, Mary. And Chester's argument is that Matthew was making a really subtle gesture to signify that Mary was a prostitute.
Mary, the mother of Jesus.
Yes.
Whoa.
And not
Whoa.
a virgin in the way that
wow.
we understand the word virgin,
oh my
but
God.
a virgin in the understanding of the word to mean unmarried.
Okay, right. Like I'm tingling because what you just described, like your revelation, like you read through it and you enjoyed it, but then your revelation kind of after the fact, like that plus what you're actually like the argument he's making, like this is why I love this medium so damn much.
Yeah.
It is like you can make these kinds of points and do these kind of subtle things and like, oh God, I am immediately going to go grab this today because I need to have this now.
Yeah, I mean,
I love that so much.
It's funny because that is probably like, it could be argued like, is the most controversial point or something.
Mm-hmm.
When you read this really careful afterword that he has written, you know, I was torn reading that. Like I felt like, well, is he explaining too much?
Mm-hmm.
You know, but it's not that. What he's doing is saying, you know, he depicted these stories in this way, and they are touching, and they get you to see the characters in a new way. And then this afterward is this really completist version of, don't think that I'm maligning your religion or telling these stories out of school. He's citing all the scholars and translations and non-canonical books that tell these stories too. And he's going through it very carefully. And, you know, with all these block quotes of saying, you know, this is how this author saw this relationship. And, but in addition to that, he has made like some original scholarly decisions here. Mm-hmm. And that's partly why he's chosen these specific stories to tell. Mm-hmm. And it was just fascinating to read that. Oh, I mean, I just can't get over it. It is so, it's so interesting. And in fact, in the middle of this afterword, which, like I said, is almost 100 pages, he says, to counter someone else's argument, he says, there are two things I would cite from the Bible to counter, two stories I would cite from the Bible to counter this argument. One is this story, blah, blah, blah. And the other is the book of Job. If you're not familiar with it, I've illustrated it here. So in the middle of the afterword,
oh my God,
illustrated the story of Job to back up his argument about biblical obedience and how that argument backs up his argument about prostitution. I mean, it is so beautiful and sophisticated. And when I was wandering around the comic book store yesterday, I was doing it specifically like, can I find anything that magical again? Like, I want more of this.
Yeah.
So there are biographical details that are fascinating to this. I have not read it, but I knew that Chester Brown's previous book was called Paying for It and is a story of his relationship with prostitutes. And so he even tells that sort of as a disclosure at the end of this. He's like, here's what you need to know about me. I consider myself a Christian, but I don't believe in these parts of the gospel. I believe in this. And I have had a relationship with, like, I have only been with one single prostitute for the last 11 years. And this is what that relationship is like. And so, you know, he's coming to this from, like, he's, you know, fully transparent about how he's coming to this issue.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that.
And you get that feeling of like, he's probably trying to make this argument to maybe justify a little bit of how he feels about prostitution. Mm-hmm. But so much of it rings true when you, like, he has done such a great job of picking these stories out. And even in the afterward, you know, all those places I pointed out where I was a little, like, I started to get suspicious about, like, do I remember all these details? He explains why the details have changed in his story, because he'll say, well, yes, but in this translation of the same story that was in a book that wasn't included in the Bible, this is why this happens. And that makes more sense because it's a more, you know, the parable of the talents, the way you've heard it doesn't really make sense, because in that parable, the outcome for two of these slaves is exactly the same. And it doesn't make any sense to tell a parable where two people have the same outcome. Of course, you would have three different, you know, examples and then three different outcomes. And so then he says, well, so in this translation, if you look this up, you'll find out that this was how it was originally written. And then they probably censored it when they told it in Matthew. So, you know, so it's like he's done all this research to, like, he's obviously read the Bible and gone, that's a weird way to tell that story. And then he's done the research to show like, oh wait, yeah, my instinct was right. That is a weird way to tell it because it was originally told this way. And it's just so interesting and fascinating. I can't say enough good things about it.
Well, let me jump in real quick.
Yeah, please do.
As you were talking, I've been looking up Chester Brown, and I feel ashamed for not knowing his career more in depth. I shall now. Well, and he's been doing it for a while. Apparently, he's had different thematic periods. He's been around the alt comic scene for a while. Yeah. But apparently, since the late '90s, he has been known for his detailed annotations. And he's also somebody who goes back and alters and reformats older works. So he's constantly sort of rethinking his path. I love that because he's like, people rag on George Lucas for that, but I love an artist who constantly kind of goes back and rethinks. Because at the end of the day, art, and especially art in this format, is not meant to be the world as you see it. It's meant to be the world as the artist sees it. And that may be true. It may be distorted. It may be it's all through their lens. So being able to see and understand religion and religious context through his eyes, and especially given his personal experience, as you mentioned, like he's had a relationship with a prostitute, like that, encapsulating that into a book and then having him not only give you that sort of slice or that lens, but then explain why he sees it that way. Like that's satisfying. That is so satisfying.
Yeah. And it's the art, the way you can use the art to manipulate that thinking, like the way, like, as I described, as I was having this experience going, okay. So, I'm not like a Bible scholar, but I've heard this story before and I don't really remember these details. Like just to have those things start throwing me off.
Yeah.
Was perfect. Like he was doing exactly in this very, very simple, 4 panels per page format, putting that doubt in my head that I remember the story correctly, but then he's explaining it later. He sees it as his job to make this scholarly interpretation and argument, not just to plant doubts, he's not just sort of, spraying doubt everywhere. Which was really fascinating. So I keep using the word fascinating. I mean, I was obviously just mind blown on this thing.
Well, you have sold a copy. I'm glad. I'm kind of glad I waited because I like going into it knowing that there's all this extra context. That just makes me all the more excited. It's interesting too. As I was in Floating World yesterday, they have a shelf dedicated to all things humanoids, essentially. And there's more. They had Jodorowsky titles that I'd never heard of, but they had something there called Deconstructing Inkle. So one of my favorite books, and one that I'm going to get into at some point in a future episode soon, is just The Inkle by Jodorowsky and Moebius. But I almost want to get this Deconstructing Inkle first because that is such a complicated. It's one of the seminal graphic novels of all time. And I feel like I need to get that. As much as I understand it, I want to get that to hash through the themes, the characters, like really kind of dissect what's there. And I almost think that and what you see Chester do at the in the appendices, if you will, of this book, that almost needs to be. And we try to do it on this show. We try to break down these things and give extra context. And then hopefully in a way get you to read them and increase our own appreciation of them. But I feel like there's a class of graphic novel now that almost requires that, to really get into especially if it comes from the author's point of view. That's incredible. It's like going to a gallery and having the artist standing right there going, well, here's what I was thinking when I made this. And here's the thing. Like that's such a richer experience. And I know you can't have that every time, but man, that to me is where this medium really shines, is when you can get that perspective and then why. And you can immediately, it's almost like a Q&A after the fact. Like, tell us, what was going through your mind when you made this? I love that so much.
Yeah. I'm sort of torn thinking about it now. Was this literally the best format to sort of split the book in half, where half is the comic and then half is the afterword. I wonder if it would have been as effective if he had notes on each chapter after the story was told, to where, so that maybe my radar wouldn't have gotten, I wouldn't have detected so many blips, like if I'd read a story and then read what he had changed on it, would I have thought, oh, okay, I see he's making some changes. But because I didn't want to tell it to you this way, but when my radar went off at one point, I flipped into I guess I did say that I did flip into the afterword. and sort of read a little bit of the argument, before I read his Matthew chapter. So when I got to the Matthew chapter, I knew exactly where he was going. I was like, I get it. Okay, so that's what Chester's doing. But I actually think it just sort of works that way. Like you're aware of this afterward. I mean, unless you just literally buy the book and don't flip through it, you're going to notice that half of it is just written words.
Yeah.
So it does serve that purpose of like, I can just flip to the back and see what section he's referencing. And I'm torn, but I love the way he did it. So nice. I don't think there's a right or wrong there. It's a book that I would love to have a proper book club on, so I could just bounce all these ideas off people, because so much of that resonates with sort of how I experienced Christianity when I was, a Christian, and that feeling of like, this split between obedience and love is a very interesting problem in the Bible, and in the stories and in the faith that people keep, and Brown's argument is clearly that like all these parables, the Cain and Abel story, the prodigal son, these are parable, or these are stories like to show you that obedience is not the highest law, the laws were written by men. And all that the Christian experience is supposed to be is about love. And that is really Brown's biggest argument. And that is a thing that I have, felt all of my, reaching back into my teenage years. So all of my adult life, that's a thing I've always connected to. And it's a thing that when people become too, what do you want to call it? Like they're too, let's bring up Scientology again. Like the thing we keep seeing about Scientology is that, I mean, there's an interesting thing in all the research and reading and listening and watching that you and I have done on so many documentaries is that the problem is that these people will not allow their book of law to change at all.
Yeah.
So they're literally washing windows with newspaper and vinegar because that's what this idiot sci-fi writer told them to do in the 50s. Yeah. And he wrote a memo about it. Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many parts in that Leah Remini show where they just show you the document. Like, this is how to feel about reporters. Yeah. This is how to feel about the government. And these are things that like a man who'd had a mental break, like wrote these dumb memos, and people are following them to the letter this day. And, that's a thing that, Christianity, to its credit, does not really have. That's the ongoing conversation with all the denominations and what canonically appears in the Bible. And, these are arguments and conversations essentially about what we believe, or, what Christians believe. So I just really sympathized with a lot of Brown's arguments. Now, not all of it.
Yeah. But, and you don't have to,
exactly.
I love that point. I mean, it should go without saying, but like, let's be honest, like you're not ever meant to, especially when it comes to like, religious dissections, like the whole point is not to be convinced to whole soup to nuts on whatever somebody's saying. Like, take the parts you like, let it impact your perception on things. And, maybe it expands your awareness or maybe it gives you another twist or another lens to look at something through. Like, you don't have to go, well, this is all true. It's an artist's job is to show you the world as they see it. And maybe in doing so, it expands your own perceptions. Yeah. It's like taking a drug without taking a drug. It's like doing mushrooms or ayahuasca or even cannabis, but you don't have you can get high through the lens of somebody else like that. I mean, that to me kind of really sums up this medium. It's like you get to experience the world through somebody's eyes and get a perspective that you never had before. And you can put it on your shelf and pull it back out anytime. And that perception may change. Your perception of that work may change. It's like and what a great way. I mean, is there a better format? I'm sounding like we're on a damn telethon. Like, but really, is there a better format to examine religion through? I mean, honestly, like you and I have a lot of really kind of similar opinions and sort of
curiosities, questions.
Yeah, around religion, which is great. But like, I love this format or this medium to kind of dissect and get through and think through things in an interesting way and see how that matches up with where we are as a society and as a world now versus then. And God, that's so fulfilling. I don't want to say anymore. You summed it up.
No, and what you just said now, I think, puts a period on the end of that sentence. Like this is, so it's Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus by Chester Brown. It's on Drawn and Quarterly. And Taylor talked about East of West by Jonathan Hickman and Nick Dragotta. Taylor, where can people find this podcast?
You can find us anywhere podcasts are. I was going to say sold. Anywhere you get your podcasts: Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, Pocket Casts, SoundCloud. Wherever you are is where we are. You can also find us online at findusthere.org. We're going to have some new Coffee and Comics updates coming soon. In the meantime, you can find me on Instagram and Twitter. I am by Taylor Trask on those networks. And where can they find you?
I am at Hey Todd A on those networks. And that is a great lead into something we wanted to talk about, which is, so if you're listening to this like the week it is released, which would be April something. I don't know, because the 18th.
April of 2018. The world is still spinning. We are all still here. We still have electricity. So if future generations are looking back on what life was like,
right,
here we are.
We released this on New Comic Book Day, which is Wednesdays. The next Wednesday, we're telling you in advance, we're all going to discuss Vision.
Yes.
The collection of Vision that we talked about getting on Amazon. You might want to check there. We got it for 99 cents, I believe. But if not, go to your local comic book shop, buy the complete series of Vision. And this is our lead in to talking about Avengers Infinity War. So next week, we're going to read Vision, and then the week after that, we're going to read Infinity Gauntlet. Please send your questions to us on Twitter and Instagram. That would be very cool, and we will post about it during the week and talk about it on the show next week. Thank you, Taylor.
Thank you, Todd.
Thank you, everyone else, for listening. We will see you next week. Bye.
Happy reading.